Good evening from Manchester, New Hampshire, where tonight it looks like Nikki Haley might beat expectations, at least from the polls. But she did not beat Donald Trump. Just about 11 minutes after polls closed tonight, NBC News projected that Trump would win the New Hampshire primary and make it 2 in a row after his resounding victory in Iowa just last week. Here's what the numbers look like at this hour. It was a result that gave the Biden campaign an opening, with the president saying tonight that regardless of what Nikki Haley does from here, the general election race has begun. And yet, Nikki Haley is promising to stay in the race as of tonight.
Now, you've all heard the chatter among the political class. They're falling all over themselves, saying this race is over. Well, I have news for all of them. New Hampshire is first in the nation. It is not the last in the nation.
She's right. It's not the last in the nation. And in that pretty defiant speech, she made pretty clear she has every intention to carry on, and she has every right to carry on. For what it's worth, as she was talking, I heard her promise there to carry on, not as a promise to stay in necessarily until South Carolina, which is a month from now, but a promise to basically stay in until tomorrow or a little bit longer. She likely wants to give herself some space to go home to her advisors, to think about a real path forward, to see if there's a real path forward. And she has to be honest about whether there is one or not. Because the states coming up, including South Carolina, which is her home state, and next on the docket, is heavily favors Donald Trump. They're more like the Iowa electorate than they are the New Hampshire electorate that we saw tonight. And the primary calendar after that is Trump-friendly by design, literally designed by his supporters to benefit him. So Haley might stick around for a little bit. We'll see. But if President Biden is right, Trump is very likely to lead his party into another general election. Tonight has made that all the more clear. Tonight, it's also important for us to understand why his brand of politics works for so many of his voters, why they seem to be buying the vision of America that he's selling. Take a look at this NBC News exit poll out of New Hampshire tonight. A candidate who fights for people like me was the most important quality in deciding who to vote for tonight. And among those who valued that quality the most, nearly 90% voted for Trump. It speaks to the perception of Trump's voters that they are under siege, that Trump's grievances are somehow their own. That's what he tells them, that he will be their champion. And they believe that he, Donald Trump, will fight for them. It's just like how evangelicals in Iowa last week overwhelmingly believed that the twice-divorced womanizing candidate is the best choice for them because he would be a fighter for them. Or how the Live Free or Die state just decisively picked the authoritarian in waiting to be their nominee. It may not make sense on paper, it may bend your mind, but in reality, what Trump is pitching is working with lots of Republican voters. And tonight's results are a stark reminder of that. And going forward into what looks like it may be the longest general election in history, it's important for us to all to understand how and why Trump locked this up so quickly. I've got an all-star panel of guests standing by to talk about all of it, but let's get straight to the great Steve Kornacki, who's still cooking away at the big board. Steve, tell us how this all happened tonight.
Yeah, a couple ingredients here. First of all, we got 3/4 of the vote in now. You see Trump with a lead here of almost 11 points, 10.7 over Nikki Haley. I think realistically there are some areas here, the city of Lebanon, Durham, where the University of New Hampshire is, town of Amherst down here, that are going to give Haley a little bit more, but they're going to be offset. Some big towns down here that we expect big Trump numbers in. So I think realistically, expect this to be a double-digit Trump victory. Early in the night with the first exit polls and even some of the first cities and towns to report, I think we got a sense that maybe this was going to be narrow, 5 points less. I think it's ultimately going to end up a double-digit Trump victory. A couple things to key in on here. Number one, we've talked about Haley's strength being with economically upscale voters, places with high concentrations of college degrees, with independent voters, certainly, and the places on the map that fit that profile. You know, a good example here, just go to the third largest city in the state, Concord. You know, Haley wins it. It's good news for her, but if she really wanted to have a chance tonight, she should have been close to 60% here. She finishes just over 50%. So that's an area that's demographically suited to her. She did well. She didn't do nearly well enough. A surprise for her where she really fell short is in Nashua. This is the second largest city in the state. And again, demographically, it should be right in her wheelhouse. She should have won here by, close to 10 points if she was going to have a shot statewide. She actually loses it outright to Donald Trump. So she really did kind of underperform in some of the areas that were demographically suited for her. Didn't do terribly, but I think underperformed in them. And then what happens for her is when you get to the smaller towns where the median income is a bit lower, where the college degree concentration is lower, she really struggled in those places in Iowa, and it continues right over to New Hampshire. I mean, I'll give you an example. Here's New Ipswich, right on the Massachusetts border. You got Fitchburg, Mass is kind of right south of there, but this is a working class town. It's a small town. Look at that. By a 3-to-1 margin, Trump is beating her. She just can't sustain those kinds of losses, and you see things of that degree throughout the state. So, she wasn't strong enough in her strongest areas, and she just got blown out in places like that. Here's the bottom line. Now, take a look at the exit poll here. When we asked folks, let me call it up on the screen, this is it. This electorate was basically half Republican and half non-Republican. Among those who were Republicans in this primary, Trump won by basically 50 points. 74 Trump, 25 Haley. Among independent voters, they made up 43% of the electorate. Haley 60, Trump 38. And among Democrats, this is an unusually high number for a Republican primary in New Hampshire. Self-identified Democrats, 88-6 Haley. So the strength for her was just overwhelmingly, to the extent this was a good performance for her, it was almost strictly on the backs of non-Republicans. And just based on sort of the rules in New Hampshire, the political traditions in New Hampshire, the demographic makeup of New Hampshire, this was the perfect mix for Nikki Haley, for a candidate with the strengths that she has shown. And she still is going to lose it would appear, probably by double digits. So if you take the kind of performance she had with Republicans, losing them by 50 points, self-identified Republicans, and you just start going through what's next in this race. Nevada's a very complicated story. Essentially, the next contest is Haley's South Carolina a month from now. If the mix is like we just showed you with Republicans, independents, Democrats in South Carolina, she's going to get blown out. Like a good night for her with that would be a 20-point loss in South Carolina. She has not shown an ability to win over core Republicans in meaningful numbers. She has not shown an ability to really tap into that blue-collar, working-class base that Donald Trump has really brought into, has accelerated their movement into the Republican Party. She has completely failed to tap into that. So if she couldn't get it done in New Hampshire, and if she can't even get it into single digits in New Hampshire, look, it's a tough question for her. You go to your home state of South Carolina, she's gotten some good press, she's gotten some positive attention, but she could be facing a massive loss in her home state. It just doesn't look anything like New Hampshire.
Yeah, the demographics just seem to get harder and harder after here. Steve Kornacki, I know you've been working your tail off at that big board. Thank you so much for staying up late with us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. You got it.
And joining me now here in Manchester, NBC News correspondent Von Hilliard and reporter for the Boston Globe, James Pindell, and with us, former RNC chairman and co-host of The Weekend on MSNBC, Michael Steele, former Obama campaign manager, my former boss, David Plouffe, and former senator from Missouri, Claire McCaskill, who is the co-host of the MSNBC podcast, How to Win 2024. So, Von, I'm going to start with you because you've probably spent more time, I think it's safe to say, at Trump rallies, following Trump, watching Trump, than any of us. And I think it's so important on a night like this to really understand his base of supporters. He had a surprising to, I think, many people, base of support in groups that bend your mind, that don't make sense on paper. So tell us a little bit more about who comes to his rallies, who are his most dedicated supporters, and what are people misunderstanding about his coalition?
I appreciate that acknowledgement, Jen. And there was the rally this summer. It was in Pickens, South Carolina, a rural community, and it was probably 90-something degrees. And there were actually tens of thousands of folks that came out months before the South Carolina primary to come and see Donald Trump. And it was so striking that day. I was looking to my producer at the time, and I was like, this thing isn't going away. These folks have had the chance to see him time and again. And what it comes down to, the conversations over the last year, is strength. And in that number from the exit poll,
the strong man.
The strong man. and that he is fighting for people like me. When I go and ask folks why Donald Trump, it is the word strength. He is strong. And Donald Trump is conditioning folks to want a leader that is strong. Just this weekend, here in New Hampshire, he said, quote, "It's nice to have a strong man running your country," when talking about Viktor Orban here. And when we're talking about government, right, we're talking about something, you know, it can be a little clunky. But when Donald Trump says, "I can end these wars, I can stop the immigration crisis, I can," in a speech just this weekend, he said, "When I was president, I saw some homeless encampments in D.C. and I ordered them gone." Folks believe that he has the strength to take care of this himself. And that is what they're looking for of their next leader. And that is indicative in coming out in the results we saw, not only in Iowa, but here among registered Republicans in the state of New Hampshire.
It's such an interesting thing. I really appreciate you breaking that down. Michael, so I want to go to you because you are always a straight talker. And I think some of what we saw in the outcome tonight is maybe an underestimation, in my view, of even how well Trump might do among groups like highly educated voters, higher income voters, some of the groups that Nikki Haley was really supposed to dominate in. What do you think that's about? Did we underestimate? Did we get it wrong?
I think there's always been a level of underestimation when it comes to the very thing that Vaughn was talking about. And the reality of it is, and I cannot emphasize this enough, I've been saying this to folks for, I don't know, 6 years. There are a lot more people who support Donald Trump than we want to admit. And this is a big red flag for Democrats. When you look at the numbers from 16 to 20, that's not all Republicans. When you look at a state like New Hampshire, and everyone wants to go, or Iowa even, well, he didn't get, you have 47, 48% of Republicans voted against him. Yeah, but he still got 51% given everything everyone knows about him. Tonight, given everything we know about him, and the turnout that, supposedly was going to come, almost creating this kind of wave against Donald Trump, comprised of Democrats and independents. Well, guess what? He broke the wave before it hit the shore. It didn't amount to too much of anything. As Steve aptly noted, Donald Trump is going to walk away with a double-digit victory in New Hampshire. And so the reality going forward and the warning sign for this general election, which began tonight. So, Nikki, I give it 2 weeks. Okay, go save face. But guess what? 2 weeks, because you are not going to stand on the ballot against Trump in your home state and take a 20-point drubbing at a minimum. That is political suicide for a governor who wants to be president in 28. So I just think we need to be realistic about what's happening right now in New Hampshire as a bellwether for what this campaign is going to look like. Don't get it twisted, people. There are a lot more people out in this country who like that strong man narrative, and they ain't all Republicans.
That is very true. We cannot be ostriches, as I often like to say. Can't keep the head in the sand. Claire, let me ask you, Nikki Haley, she was very defiant tonight in her speech. It was well delivered, but she seemed to commit to staying in the race for quite some time. I'm of the view, which I just said a few minutes ago, that doesn't really mean she's committed till South Carolina. It just means she's committed till for now. How did you hear of that speech, and what do you think the conversations that are happening within the Haley team at this point in time?
Well, her speech made Trump really mad. That's
true.
very clear.
Clearly.
I mean, he lost it on the stage tonight. It was really awkward and ugly. It often is with him. 2 or 3 things here. First, the polling was not accurate. The average of all the polls going to New Hampshire said Trump was going to win by 20. He's not going to win by 20. So he's going to win more like 10, 11, maybe 12, but I'm guessing it'll probably end up somewhere around 11. Plenty of Republicans don't want Donald Trump. 25% of the Republicans refusing to vote for Donald Trump, along with a majority of independents, can win all of the swing states that Biden needs to win. And frankly, all the politicians being for Trump, that's in Haley's favor, too. I mean, that's kind of what they want to hear. Trump, it doesn't seem well to me. He looks weird. He's angry. He's confused. I think that is going to play out. And the more he's angry, the more it's going to play out. And the Biden campaign should take note of that. And finally, Joe Biden did really well in a state that was really cranky with him. Keep in mind that Democrats in New Hampshire were angry that he was not participating in their primary. They were mad at him. So the fact that his name is not on the ballot, and he's going to end up with north of probably 65% of the votes. There's a 67. He may end up with 70% in a state that really was kind of cranky, and they had to work hard to write in his name. It's a good night for Joe Biden. I think that there's a lot of growth potential, and frankly, a lot of data, as my friend David Plouffe has said tonight, a lot of data they can use to target their messages going forward.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that, and they're definitely happy to turn the page on this night, but it turned out way better than it certainly could have. James, you've been covering a lot of these for many years, even though you're very young, of course. What, if anything, surprised you about the outcome tonight and the data that we have seen so far?
Well, look, this is also a fluid race. So we talk about this is the Republican Party. No, it changed. You know, the first four primary states, or first four caucus states and primary states, this was the place where he could be taken out. This is the place where Donald Trump was always the most vulnerable. He was consistently at 50% or higher in, Iowa, and then obviously South Carolina, Nevada. And after
Chris Christie dropped out, it was like a real moment where that felt like maybe it could happen.
Maybe it could happen. But even heading into, let's say, last weekend, before Iowa, he's still at 45%, 44%. His win in Iowa, he got a bump. DeSantis got out. He got a bump there. And so he just reflected. He was at 45. Now he's in the low 50s. The race did fundamentally change. And look, I spent 2 hours going around to polling places because I love this, and I love talking to voters as they're making their decisions.
That's why you're covering it.
Exactly.
It's good. You're in the right field,
voters
the right
are voting.
job.
I know. And there were three buckets. There was people who would walk in and say, my mind's made up, I'm Trump. There's a second bucket, and by the way, these are in order of terms of status. The second bucket was the I'm a never Trumper, or I'm done with Trump, or he's too old. Then the third bucket was way down here. And it was like, I like Nikki Haley because she's a woman and she's running, and maybe they're a woman, or I like her stances on things. We did hear the strongman argument a lot, by the way, even from women, even from college-educated women on foreign policy. They thought the strong thing would work. But in that third bucket, right now, if politics has become cultural, it is your cultural identity. I found a lot of folks this week who are Republican who say, I'm a Republican. Nikki Haley is not really the Republican. He won Iowa. It's over. Why are we even having this conversation? There was a finality there that I don't think we've fully understood and grasped at this week.
It's real. I mean, Viktor Orban, first of all, is having a weird moment in Trump's speeches, but it just may be working. David Plouffe, before we're going to take a quick break in a moment, but what was the piece of data or thing that stuck out to you as a surprise or the most interesting development from tonight's outcome?
Well, I think, the polls, I think, on average, I think Claire said were 20. I think the last Globe poll was 22. So, I'm not sure that, Trump, this is like some great outcome. So the margin doesn't surprise me. I think the thing that surprised me, actually, Jen, was less the results than his speech tonight. It is really hard to screw up a victory speech in politics. It's easier than a layup in basketball, and yet he screwed it up. And I guarantee you that was not the plan. I'm sure there was a speech, there was a teleprompter, and then Nikki Haley really got under his skin. And there's a lot to learn. I think you can destabilize Trump. You have to be willing to play his dirty game a little bit. But, that surprised me. And my guess is I agree with you that Haley may not make it to South Carolina, but Trump's really ungracious speech and unhinged speech, I think, is going to make it harder for Haley to take the off-ramp. And then I would say this, he's basically, he's not a sitting president, but, he's a quasi-incumbent president. And he barely got over 50 tonight, and he barely got over 50 in Iowa. And so there's a lot of people out there who are not general election voters. They're competing in Republican primaries, even Republicans, not independents, who I think are, in the exit polling, concerned about Trump being the nominee. And so for the Biden campaign, if they can add a point or two of Republican support over what they got in 20, That's a really important ingredient to winning. So those things stood out to me. But at the end of the day, you know, Haley's out of road. Trump's going to be the nominee, you know, unless something happens from a health standpoint. And the just question if what Trump should have said tonight is the primary's over. Nikki ran a great race. Thanks, all my supporters. Joe Biden, I'm going to see you in Wisconsin. But he didn't do that, bizarrely. So that's the thing that jumped out. He can't help himself.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely, of course, absolutely right. I mean, he could have done a 3, 5, 8-minute speech that was quick, to the point, but he only has like a limited tolerance for slight normalcy. We will dig into this further. We're going to dig into exit polls and much, much more. Michael Steele, Claire McCaskill, thank you both so much for staying up late with us. We have a lot more to get to. We're going to be back after a quick break, live from Manchester, New Hampshire. With his victory in New Hampshire tonight, Donald Trump became the first Republican candidate to win both Iowa and New Hampshire since 1976, when those two states began leading the primary calendar. And while his nomination looks more inevitable than ever, the exit polls may actually give us some clues about his strengths and weaknesses as the campaign moves forward. On the issues, Trump outperformed Nikki Haley among voters who said the economy matters most to them. And he won big with those who said immigration is their top issue, which is a lot of people in New Hampshire. On the flip side, Nikki Haley beat Trump among voters who said that either foreign policy or abortion were the most important issues to them. A more fundamental indicator of voter preference, however, was belief in the big lie. No surprise, Trump won overwhelmingly among voters who believed Joe Biden did not legitimately win the presidency in 2020, and Haley won overwhelmingly among those who believed the truth, that the results of the 2020 election were indeed legitimate. It tells a story of some of the divides within the Republican Party, which may also be an opportunity for the Biden campaign. Joining our conversation here in Manchester, NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray, and lover of all data is my shorthand title for you. So, Mark, let's dig. And of course, we still have Vaughn and James here, and David Plouffe. Let's dig into some of the data. I gave a little bit of an overview of it, but you learn a lot from these exit polls. They're not perfect, but it does tell you about the electorate. What else stuck out to you?
So again, I'm a big believer in the composition of the electorate, and the fact that this was 51% Republican. To me, you know, Donald Trump did really well, won those voters by about 70%, by 50 percentage points. But that's down from the 82% Republican that we ended up seeing in Iowa. And as we look ahead to South Carolina and Super Tuesday states, that Republican range is going to be in the 60s and 70s, which shows you that Haley's going to have a tougher path. And then, Jen, the other number that I really think is really interesting, and you didn't show it there, was the exit poll on do you oppose or support bans on abortion?
Yes, I thought this was so interesting,
and
too.
66% say that they oppose bans on abortion. This is a Republican primary electorate. And so when we talk about like clues as we look ahead to the general election, if it is President Biden versus Donald Trump, that abortion, even in a Republican primary, you had 2/3 saying, hey, I don't want you to ban abortion.
It's so interesting because I think that number would have been different before the Supreme Court decision. I mean, I think it feels like it was such a motivator. So, Vaughn, I mean, looking at this data and kind of these exit polls, again, imperfect, but they do tell you a lot about the electorate. Anything surprise you?
I think when we're trying to understand the Republican electorate here today, I think that part of the conversation also has to do with how much did the year of 2023 and could these candidates have actually won on any of these issues here? Because for Donald Trump, he takes such a cudgel to any of the developments that come out in the news, right? We're talking about the immigration deal, the border security measure here, right, that is currently about to be struck in the U.S. Congress. And yet, where is Donald Trump? He is on the phone with the Speaker of the House saying, don't do this deal.
Because he wants to run on it.
Because he wants to run on it. And yet, look, when voters said that immigration was their top issue, who do they turn to? The guy that doesn't want this border security measure. And so he continues, despite not even being the elected official, despite Congress not having to listen to him, he continues to own so many of these issues in a way that is defining the Republican Party. And it's just, when I talk to folks, he continues to just very much be the leader of this Republican Party, and he never stopped being the leader of the Republican Party.
The immigration issue, I mean, I've only been here for 4 days, but it obviously popped in the exit polls. It is something that comes up again and again. It was in Haley's stump speech, Trump's stump speech. Explain that to us. I mean, we are very far from the Mexico border right now. We're close to the northern border, which, of course, Haley talks about. But what's going on there?
Look, this has been a cultural issue, not just its own bucket. It's its cultural issue, and it has been for a very long time. What's fascinating to me is in this state, there's two things as a Republican you could never mess with. You could never mess with taxes. They always had to go lower, or they had to stay the same. The second was guns. And now it's just immigration. Immigration has obviously emerged as the leading issue, in our poll anyway, among Republican voters because of this cultural issue.
It's such an interesting, and now, Mark, I mean, the other thing that's interesting about the turnout is, of course, the larger percentage of Democrats, right? That is, as far as the data we have, and the large number of independents. What does that tell you about, I don't know, who these people are, or some of them Biden people, or some of them some of them Biden people who were just out to kind of defeat Trump? What's it all about?
Yeah, so it just shows you how unique New Hampshire is compared to Iowa and the other contests that we're going to play, that big group of independent, undeclared voters. And also because there really wasn't a Democratic race, or at least a sanctioned Democratic primary, there was the ability for people, you know, who are an undeclared voter, they could actually vote in the Democratic or Republican primary and said, you know, I'm normally a Democratic voter, but I don't know, I like Nikki Haley. And so we did see 6% of, according to our exit poll, were Democrats.
Which is double what it was last time, I believe.
And it broke, like, you know, 80, 90 to 0 for Haley over Donald Trump. And so, yes, and we ended up hearing from Donald Trump, remember, either on his Truth Social and in his victory speech, talking about it was those moderates and Democrats who were voting for Nikki Haley and voting against me, too. So he was paying attention to those numbers as well.
No doubt he was paying attention to those numbers. Von Hillier, James Pindell, Mark Murray, thank you all so much for staying up late with me this evening. Our live coverage from Manchester continues after a very quick break. We will be right back. Well, President Biden won the Democratic primary tonight in New Hampshire, and he wasn't even on the ballot. Voters had to write in his name, and he still notched an easy win over Congressman Dean Phillips. But the president doesn't win any delegates because the DNC selected South Carolina as the party's first primary because to better align with the country's demographics and penalize New Hampshire for going ahead of it. So tonight was largely a symbolic victory, but it's definitely better than losing if you're the Biden campaign. For them, they really just wanted to put this all behind them. The president also has a statement out tonight focused on his likely general election opponent. It is now clear, the statement says, that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee. And my message to the country is the stakes could not be higher. So for President Biden, whether or not Nikki Haley is staying in or how long she's staying in, he is moving on to the general election against Donald Trump. For Biden and the campaign, the race is on. Joining me now, former chief spokesperson for Vice President Kamala Harris, now a co-host of The Weekend on MSNBC, Simone Sanders Townsend, and also with us, Democratic Congressman Maxwell Frost of Florida. Congressman, I want to start with you because this does feel like we're at a turning point here, regardless of what Nikki Haley decides or how long she's in or what happens over the next couple of days. And the president and the campaign really indicated tonight they're moving on to the general election. What did you make of that, and do you think that's the right decision?
I do believe it's the right decision. And I think what we've seen is, look, there's been this grueling primary process going on the Republican side. We've been wondering how long it would be drawn out, and now they're coalescing around the MAGA movement, the far-right neo-fascist movement that wants to work to take away people's rights across the entire country. And that is going to be the agenda of the Republican Party going into this general election. And so I'm glad the president put out that press release, which really puts out the stakes, the high stakes of this election. It's democracy versus somebody who's running a campaign of retribution, right? He's someone who's running because he wants to protect himself and not the country. And so it's really unfortunate. The other thing I'll say that we got from these returns is that Donald Trump is not as popular in his party as he maybe used to be. And that is a really big sign here.
Yeah, that's true, and such an important point. As you dig into this data, there's some really interesting stuff in there. I mean, we were talking about abortion, the opposition to the abortion ban, but lots of stuff that is good, are good lessons moving forward. So, Simone, let me bring you into this conversation because, you know, there's often this debate. You and I have done presidential campaigns, of course, about, you know, if you're the incumbent president or you're in that position of strength, you may traditionally want the other side to kind of battle it out, to spend money, to kind of fight it out and attack each other. In this case, it feels a little different. I mean, for the Biden campaign, they're moving on. My bet is their preference would be for Nikki Haley to kind of move out of this so they can make it very clear to voters this is between them and Donald Trump. But what do you think?
I mean, I would agree with you, Jen, and I think, frankly, whether Nikki Haley stays or not, it is definitely a Joe Biden, Donald Trump race right now. And I would just note for people out there that Nikki Haley is looking towards South Carolina. I know there's a month in between the South Carolina Republican primary, but the numbers don't look great. And there has not been a nominee for either party that has lost their home state and gone on to win the nomination. And there's only been 5 folks in the history who have lost their home state in a general election and have gone on to be president. One was Donald Trump in recent history, and the other one was Nixon, I do believe. And he wasn't even on the ballot in California. So I say all that to say that what the campaign is doing today, they had a huge rally in Virginia, a place where Democrats swept the tables in the House of Delegates and the state Senate in the last election on the issue of abortion. Abortion is going to be a motivating issue. It's an economic issue, and it's something that I think the campaign rightfully is leaning into. So I think we're going to see more of that, as we should.
Yeah. Undoubtedly. I mean, and to your point on abortion, I mean, there are about 12 states that will likely have initiatives, the ballot initiatives on abortion, Florida being one of them. But there's a lot of issues that young people care about, that key demographics of the Democratic Party care about, that I think they'd like to see the Democratic Party and specifically the president talking about. So, Congressman, we're now in the general election. What would you like to see the campaign focus on? What do you think is going to help bring back those young voters that the president really needs to be supporting him in order to win?
I think there's 2 very important messages here. The first one is obviously talking about the great work that has been done over the last several years, like passing the Inflation Reduction Act, the most amount of money, resources ever put towards the climate crisis, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the first piece of gun violence legislation, gun violence prevention legislation passed in 30 years. But the second part is very important, and we have to talk about what the future looks like. What are we going to do with those next 4 years? How is that going to impact people in Florida, in North Carolina, across the entire country? And I'll tell you, I was just in Las Vegas, Nevada on behalf of the campaign, did a lot of work with young people out there, and they're very excited. But when I spoke with some specific folks, especially some of our undocumented volunteers, they were telling me the choice is simple. It's towards someone who's going to be working to fight to reform our immigration system, or somebody who wants to deport my family. And Marjorie Taylor Greene said it on the committee I sit on. She said, day one, when Donald Trump is elected, there will be mass deportations, and she smiled. She's talking about our teachers. She's talking about the people who helped run our communities. She's talking about Americans. And that's really what the choice is now.
It's so important. And you know who Donald Trump had standing by his side? Marjorie Taylor Greene this week in New Hampshire. He was flaunting her around here. So it's really interesting. Congressman Maxwell Frost, thank you so much for staying up with us tonight. We really appreciate your insights and your voice out there on the trail. Simone, I'm impressed with your recollection of history. You got to stay right where you are. We have more to discuss because coming up next, Donald Trump becoming the Republican nominee might not be great for news for lots of Republicans trying to win their elections next year. We're going to talk all about that right after a quick break. After Donald Trump's win in New Hampshire tonight, it is increasingly clear that he's likely to be the Republican nominee. That means that for the 5th major election cycle in a row, including both midterm and presidential years, Donald Trump will again be the face of the Republican Party. Now, if history is any indicator, that could be a big problem for Republicans across the country, because outside of Trump's surprise victory in 2016, his presence as the Republican leader has been a net negative for the party. In 2018, Republicans lost the House to Democrats in large part due to close races and upsets that were driven by suburban voters and a spike in voter enthusiasm. In 2020, Democrats won a trifecta, keeping the House, winning the Senate, and, of course, the White House. And in 2022, Republicans historically underperformed, in large part because Trump-backed candidates in competitive races who won their primaries but then went on to lose in the general election. The pattern here is that the MAGA base, the driving force in the Republican Party right now, will absolutely turn out for Donald Trump. The other side of that coin is that for all the MAGA devotees, there's been more voters who are unwilling to vote for Trump, or more importantly, willing to show up and vote against him. And that's not just my own reading of the Republican Party's nationwide losing streak. That's the take of members of Donald Trump's own party. Do you still believe he would take people down, ticket races, governor's races?
There's no question Trump on the ticket hurts our Senate races, our gubernatorial races.
When I have people come up to me who voted for Reagan in 76 and have been conservative their whole life, say that they don't want to vote for Trump again, that's a problem. So he's got to figure out a way to solve that. I think there's an enthusiasm problem overall. And then I also just think there's some voters that have checked out at this point that you got to find a way to get them back.
With Donald Trump, Republicans have lost almost every competitive election. We lost the Senate. We lost the House. We lost the White House. We lost in 2018. We lost in 2020. And we lost in 2022.
That was Nikki Haley tonight. So there we go. David Plouffe and Simone Sanders-Townsend are back with me, and joining the conversation is Tim Miller. He was the communications director for Jeb Bush's 2016 campaign, is now a writer-at-large for The Bulwark. Tim, I'm going to start with you. You're fresh meat in this conversation. It seems like kind of a catch-22 here. I mean, Trump brings in very motivated voters who like him from the MAGA base. He also motivates a lot of voters who don't like him. We saw that in the primary here. Republicans have lost 3 times now on this strategy. Why are they heading toward doing it again for a 4th? And how bad is this really for down-ticket races?
Yeah, I'm going to try to bring some high energy as the fresh meat, Jen. Why are they doing it again? Because they really like Donald Trump. I don't get it. You don't get it. It's culty, but that's why. The Republican voters are extremely excited about Donald Trump. And as you said in the intro, there is a equal or greater number of people that are absolutely turned off and disgusted by him that turn out. That's why Democrats in particular have done well in off-year elections. You didn't even get into special elections, because that Democratic base is so excited to vote against the MAGA candidates. So I think Trump being on the ballot will hurt people. I don't know if you suffered through the California Senate debate last night, but the Republican on the ballot there, Steve Garvey, he won't even say whether he's voting for Trump. Now, Republicans weren't going to win the California Senate race anyway, but that just shows you the trouble these guys are going to get in. I'm thinking of Davos Dave McCormick in the Pennsylvania Senate race. The Republican's going to run against Bob Casey. He'd love to run as a center-right moderate, but with Trump on the ballot, you can't do it. You get asked about Trump every day. He's going to have to endorse Trump. He's going to have to show up and campaign with Trump. Who knows what crazy stuff Trump will say while he's standing next to him. So it is a real problem for down-ballot Republicans, no doubt.
I mean, David, we just heard a number of his opponents acknowledge that, so I think there's a lot of people in agreement here. But you've run party committees, you've run lots of campaigns, Senate races. Who are the candidates? I mean, Tim mentioned Bob Casey. Are there others who could kind of benefit from just plastering Donald Trump all over their campaign ads, or are we just going to see that all across the country in these swing districts and swing states?
Yeah, I don't know if it'll be the main message, but certainly for those voters, swing voters, suburban voters, even maybe 58-year-old white Republican men. There's some of them who are done with Trump too, right? So I think that smart Senate candidates and House candidates will figure out, just as the Biden campaign will, how to target those people. And Trump is kind of like the political version of a cooler in Las Vegas. I mean, everything he touches, goes cold for the Republican Party. And even when he won in 2016, it was a black swan event. I mean, he won the presidency getting 46.1% of the vote nationally, and won some battleground states with under 48%. So, yeah, and I agree with Tim. I mean, I think they like him. A lot of them thought He won in 2020. Some of them still think he's a president in exile. And so, but I think basically the folks who are either running in battleground states or who lost in 18 and 20 and 22, you know, they have the scars. You know, Trump has been sort of political death. And there's nothing to suggest that this is a guy who is either interested in or capable of growing his vote coalition. You know, he'll ride or die with his MAGA core. And for a guy that, you know, needs to figure out a way to add in 6 or 7 states, including states that have Senate races, key governor's races, and tons of House races. And don't forget, the House will probably be decided in New York and California, places where Trump almost assuredly is going to get tattooed.
Yeah, I mean, it's so tricky for these candidates. I almost feel a little bad for them. Not too bad, but a little bad for them. Okay, so Simone, I'm kind of enjoying this, like, fancy-free Ron DeSantis we're seeing, we just saw in that clip. He alluded to, you know, an enthusiasm problem out there if Trump's the nominee. What do you make of that? And where do you think, if you're the Biden campaign and you're thinking about trying to turn out and engage people, you're taking advantage of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a concern that the Trump campaign should have. I don't know if it's a concern that Donald Trump himself shares. But I see that clip, and I see Ron DeSantis and Governor Sununu and former Governor Haley and all of those individuals, even just today. Governor Haley said in an interview on another network that she thought Donald Trump was still fit to be president. Ron DeSantis endorsed Donald Trump. Hasn't stood with him yet, but he did endorse him. Governor Sununu has said that if Nikki Haley does not win out, yes, he will support Donald Trump in the general. And those are the folks that I think people should be, those type of Republican voters, folks should be concerned about. The Republicans who say they don't like Donald Trump, but they're going to vote for him anyway. Those are the people, those are the sleepers, if you will, that maybe aren't enthusiastic, but they still want to, you know, they want to support a Republican candidate, even if, you know, that person is Donald Trump. And so if I'm the Biden campaign, I am looking at, you know, those soft Trump Republicans, if you will. They're not never Trumpers, but they're, I don't know, Trumpers. Maybe those are folks that are gettable. But I'm also looking at how to shore up the base, right? What about how can I drive up the enthusiasm around black voters, black women, black men, younger voters across the board, right? Women, period, suburban women especially, which are more diverse now because the millennials are living in the suburbs, and the oldest millennials are like 40, 41. How can I drive up those numbers to ensure that come November, or let's just be honest, October, when people start early voting in some places, that the enthusiasm is up there and folks are not banking on soft Trump support?
You just gave the Biden team about 100 things on their to-do list for tomorrow morning, Simone. So there you go. David Plouffe, Tim Miller, stay where you are. We're going to let Simone go since she hosts an early morning show all weekend and she needs some sleep. Thank you so much for staying up late with us tonight. We have another live hour of coverage coming up from Manchester. We've got results, we've got predictions, we've got tons of well-caffeinated guests stopping by. Stay right where you are. We're back after this. Welcome back to our special coverage of the 2024 New Hampshire primary. I'm here on the ground in Manchester, where earlier tonight, NBC News projected that former President Donald Trump will go 2 for 2 in the race for the Republican nomination. Here's where the results in New Hampshire stand right now. Trump won pretty convincingly in a state basically tailor-made for his opponent, Nikki Haley. Most tailor-made of any of the states anytime soon. Now, these results were enough for President Joe Biden to look past tonight and straight on to the general election. He put out a statement saying, "It is now clear that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee. And my message to the country is the stakes could not be higher. Game on." So the president has seen enough. Biden is moving on. The campaign's moving on to the general election, whether or not Nikki Haley stays in the race. She said tonight, by the way, that she is. But my hunch is she'll have some hard conversations with her advisors in the next few days, if not the next few hours. Because it might be hard to believe after what we've seen these past 2 weeks, but the next states on the primary calendar only become more Trump-friendly from here on out. So President Biden might very well be right. This thing might be over before it really began. For his part, Donald Trump is still digging in, and I noticed a slight shift in tone from him tonight. First, let's listen to Trump after his victory last week in Iowa, showing some uncharacteristic grace, if I might say, toward his rivals.
I want to congratulate Ron and Nikki for having a good time together. We're all having a good time together. And I think they both actually did very well. I really do. I think they both did very well.
A temporary normal tone there from Trump. Very brief, very brief. But here was Trump tonight singing a very different tune, I think it's fair to say.
I said, I can go up and I can say to everybody, oh, thank you for the victory. It's wonderful. Or I can go up and say, who the hell was the imposter that went up on the stage before and, like, claimed a victory? She did very poorly, actually. She had to win. Now, I have here, if he promises to do it in a minute or less, but the only person more angry than, let's say, me, but I don't get too angry, I get even.
Now, if this is actually the start of the general election, Trump is probably going to need the kinds of voters who supported Haley. And that may not be the best way to win them over, what he just did. Joining me now here in Manchester, Deputy Managing Editor for Politico, Sam Stein. Also with us, former Obama campaign manager and my former boss, David Plouffe, former communications director for Jeb Bush's 2016 campaign, and now writer-at-large for The Bulwark, Tim Miller, and former communications director for President Barack Obama and co-host of the MSNBC podcast, How to Win 2024, Jennifer Palmieri. So, I think we may have to, let's pull up, if we can, in the control room, that clip of Haley and her talking tonight, because clearly she got under his skin, and I think we should play it. When you're ready, let me know. Okay, let's play it.
With Donald Trump, you have one bout of chaos after another. This court case, that controversy, this tweet, that senior moment. You can't fix Joe Biden's chaos with Republican chaos. The other day, Donald Trump accused me of not providing security at the Capitol on January 6th. Now, I've long called for mental competency tests for politicians over the age of 75. Trump claims he'd do better than me in one of those tests. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. But if he thinks that, then he should have no problem standing on a debate stage with me.
So basically that, I think, may have made Trump lose his mind a little bit, which means it's kind of not hard to do that.
Right.
But we saw kind of different shades of Trump. The Iowa version for a moment, maybe also in the Fox Town Hall a few weeks ago. He was a little normie for a while in there. What does it tell you, Sam, about what the Trump campaign has to kind of manage as we move into the general election?
Well, I mean, there's a certain irony, I guess, of Trump being up there saying, oh, you can't claim victory if you didn't win, when, you know, obviously that was what he exactly did after the 2020 elections. I think it's not frustration. I think basically the Trump people, when you talk to them, they just want to get on with it, right? I mean, they see the writing on the wall, they know the math, and they see the same things we do, which is this primary, it's not over in the sense that only 3% of the delegates have been awarded, but the path just gets more and more difficult for Haley going forward. These states get more conservative. I think it was, what, 51% Republican electorate in New Hampshire. It's going to be in the 60s in South Carolina. She's not even on the ballot in Nevada. I mean, that to them signals you're in the way of us moving resources towards the general election. We don't want to spend time doing this. We don't want to spend advertising money doing this. We want to just unload on Joe Biden. So that's where the frustration is. Now, of course, a lot of this is also personal for Trump, right? Like everything is personal. And he can't fathom the idea that this person who he appointed to the UN won't kiss the ring, as Ron DeSantis famously said.
Yeah, clearly. Palmieri, when I saw Nikki Haley go out early tonight, the first thing I thought of was, Palmieri thinks this is a good idea. She's getting ahead of things. Her speech was pretty good, I thought, actually. I mean, even though all the challenges for the path forward, if you're Nikki Haley right now, what are you talking with your campaign advisors about? What are those conversations like? What are they considering about the decision that needs to be made in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, she did a good job tonight buying herself some time to make those kinds of decisions. And I think, you know, we were complaining, and Pluff's here, we were complaining last week about why she didn't get on a plane and go to New Hampshire right away and do a rally when she landed in New Hampshire and try to show manufacture. That's what you have to do, manufacture momentum from Iowa to New Hampshire. And she just didn't do any of those things. And then tonight it just felt like she did great. She came out early when it looked like the margin of victory, Trump's margin of victory, wasn't that high. She gave a justification for why she should stay in. You know, it doesn't hold up over the course of the next month, but it holds up for tonight, and that's that she's doing better. It's truly a two-person race. She's gaining ground. She certainly performed better than the polls suggested. She can say, "You're headed to my home state." What candidate? You know, candidate's like, "I'm not going to drop out in a two-person race when we're headed to my home state." And then she torqued him a little bit in trying to get him on the debate stage. Now, the whole Nevada, there's a caucus and there's a primary, and she's not on the ballot. And the caucus, it's bonkers to even try to explain, but that's not really an option for her. And does she want to lose so badly in South Carolina? In her home state? I don't know, but I think they certainly have the week to figure it out. You know, maybe after Nevada is the time to drop out, but you know, or maybe they say they're just going to hang in there and go all the way to Super Tuesday. It's not that long after. It's like a week or so after South Carolina, and you know, and hang in there for. But there's not a lot of attractive options for them to consider right now.
No, it's so tricky. And, you know, it's interesting because everybody talks about the brilliant delegate strategy, Pluff, that was run in 2008. But this is so different, right? I mean, first of all, 70% of delegates are going to be decided by the end of March. You get into this big winner-take-all by mid-March. I mean, this can't be, or explain to us here as I'm laying this out, but you know more about this than I do, why a delegate strategy for Haley doesn't really work.
Well, just the math isn't there. So, I mean, these elections haven't happened, but if we look at the demography of what we've learned in these first two and look at South Carolina, then Super Tuesday, you know, there'll be some states where Haley might get north of 40 and she'll get a chunk of delegates, but Trump's going to have a massive delegate lead. And, you know, maybe District of Columbia, maybe Vermont, those may be the only two places right now you'd say Haley could get over 50% of the vote. So all those winner-take-all states, you know, on the Democratic side were proportional all the way through. You know, Republicans, it's winner-take-all after March 15th, which, by the way, Trump really benefited from back in 2016 eventually. So I think, you know, listen, I don't think Trump's speech tonight is going to make it easier for Haley to get out. I think the fact that she got under her skin probably is a motivation to stay in. So I'm sure they'll find, you know, maybe there's new ways to run some psyops against him. I think they probably were also thinking, you know, we stay in, we get some delegates in March, and what if something happens health-wise? You know, this isn't a person who looks super well right now, verbally or physically. And the speech tonight was just bonkers political malpractice. Now, we're familiar with that, but, you know, really stupid in my view. And so at the end of the day, she's probably, I think, listen, maybe a week before South Carolina, maybe 2 weeks before, I don't think she wants to lose her home state 70-30. So maybe that's when she gets out. But I think they probably do have their eye towards March, which is we'll get some delegates on top of what we already got in Iowa, New Hampshire, and we'll be standing if something happens. That's not a particularly winning strategy. What Trump should have done tonight is ignored Nikki Haley. Said, Nikki ran a great race, and now it's me and Joe Biden. And for the life of me, I can't understand why he didn't do that. Now, maybe he'll try and do a do-over tomorrow when he sees the criticism he's taking even among some of his supporters. But that, to me, was quite puzzling tonight.
It was very odd. He also pulled Tim Scott on stage. There was a lot of strange things happening in this speech. I mean, one of the things, Tim, that is also a takeaway, and Pluff made this point earlier, is that it's easy to get under Trump's skin. We all know this, right? But we've learned a lot about Trump over the last decade that he's been front and center for all of us. What do you do with that if you're the Biden campaign, if you're running super PAC ads and on the outside and trying to kind of drive him to the point of showing the public who he is on a regular basis?
Yeah, we're staring down the barrel of the longest general election campaign in American history, so there's going to be plenty of time to try to get under his skin using tactics such as this. I think that the Biden campaign it's not exactly really their strong suit for good reason, like to take higher ground, but I think that there'll be a lot of other surrogates for Biden, other groups out there that are going to be able to troll Trump and get under his skin and get reaction from him. I do wonder, like, why we're doomed to relive 2016 over and over again, and why, like, Nikki Haley is doing exactly the same thing that all of the losing candidates did in 2016. You know, why wait until your campaign is on its last legs to troll Donald Trump in such a way to get a response from him? You know, this is her speech tonight was good. I agree with Jen, but it's kind of reminiscent of Rubio, you know, going after Trump about his little hands, like after the campaign was already over. You know, where was this at Labor Day, right? You know, there was no campaign. Donald Trump has essentially won this nomination, and there was no campaign run against him. And so, you know, to me, that's pretty maddening, especially when you see a guy tonight that looks very weak, very insane, not you know, particularly dominant. You'd think somebody would have, I don't know, tried to beat him, but Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis didn't really do that.
I think we're in the 1 a.m. hour when we say that he's very insane, and also the little hands Marco Rubio. It's bringing us really way back. The other development tonight, obviously a big one, and we haven't talked to you about this yet, Jennifer Palmieri, is the Biden campaign essentially said it's a general election. We're moving forward. They did a big abortion event today. Obviously, the president did 2 big democracy speeches. What do you think that looks like, and do you think that was the right choice by them?
Yeah, I think that you know, and we've talked about this, Jen, is that I think they came into January saying game on. You know, when he did that Valley Forge speech, that sort of set up the stakes of the election. That was on January 5th, around the anniversary of January 6th. They've been paying close attention to early primary states and battleground states. 3 trips to Pennsylvania in 10 days in January, hit South Carolina. And then, you know, it's interesting to say, you know, they understood today was the New Hampshire primary. And so you're a little nervous about what's going to happen in the Democratic side of the New Hampshire primary, right? So it was smart, I thought, to have this big pro-abortion rights event. A lot of enthusiasm, big crowd in a, you know, that was not in D.C., that was in the battleground-ish, purple-ish state of Virginia. They announced that our friend Jennifer O'Malley Dillon and Mike Donilon would be leaving the White House to join Julie Chavez Rodriguez, who's the campaign manager of the Biden campaign. That's, you know, people are happy to see that. It's not surprising. This is the normal thing that happens in a White House. Senior advisors leave to join the campaign, but it shows like focus, right? And then the third thing. That win in New Hampshire tonight was really important. 67% to ask New Hampshire voters to come out and write in Joe Biden after he dissed the state by taking away their first in the nation status with the primary. That's a big ask, and that could have gone badly. I mean, it's the kind of thing nobody actually worries about other than the campaign, and you know, they did a great job. I understand the president called the congressional delegation in New Hampshire tonight to thank everyone. You know, he's good at being gracious, getting playing in there. And then finally to declare this is the general election. And it's like, game on, we're ready to go. I think Haley staying in is fine for Biden because she is obviously getting under his skin. We're learning important things every time there is an election night. But, you know, they're saying, telling all of us, he's the guy, we're going to, you know, train our fire on him.
Yeah, and they're telling everyone it's him. Don't be wishful thinking about an alternative to him, which I think is also important. We do have to sneak in a very quick break, but everyone is sticking around with us. Thank you, everyone, again. Our special late-night coverage of the New Hampshire primary continues after this. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
For a lot of people, politics is way too personal. It's not personal for me. I voted for Trump twice. I was proud to serve America in his cabinet. I agree with many of his policies. I decided to run because I'm worried about the future of our country and because it's time to put the negativity and chaos behind us.
With Donald Trump's win in New Hampshire, we are one step closer to a likely rematch of the 2020 election. But for a candidate who essentially play-acts as the incumbent, that's not exactly the margin to expect, especially considering that the actual incumbent President Joe Biden won handily tonight in New Hampshire in a write-in campaign. And digging further into exit polls, it's possible that Donald Trump could have an enthusiasm problem. According to exit polls from NBC News, 62% of voters in tonight's primary don't consider themselves part of the MAGA movement. And 38% of tonight's voters would still be dissatisfied with if Trump were to win the nomination. That's a pretty significant share, worth discussing at least. It means there's a real question about how many of the more than 85,000 voters who voted for Nikki Haley would be willing, let's say, to vote for Biden. And if that trend is not just in New Hampshire, but one maybe we're going to look at nationwide. Back with me is Politico Deputy Managing Editor Sam Stein, and joining our conversation here in Manchester is New York Times national political correspondent Shane Goldmacher. David Plouffe, Tim Miller, and Jen Palmieri are back with me as well. So let's start with you here, Shane. Also, you have a suit. You're dressing up our table, so thank you for that.
This is humiliating.
Bringing some class here. There's this question. I mean, this is obviously an outcome that's telling us a lot about where the Republican nomination is heading, but there's interesting data for the Biden campaign here, too. I mean, it was more Democrats voting in this primary tonight than typical, double the number from the past. That means I think you could argue that these are people who want to vote against Trump. They're motivated to vote against Trump. What else are your takeaways from reporting here about some of these Haley voters, whether they'd be willing to vote for Biden if Trump is the likely nominee?
I mean, what we've seen both in New Hampshire and in Iowa is the same coalition that left the Republican Party and voted with Joe Biden in 2020 still has concerns about Donald Trump. He is weakest in those suburban, well-educated areas around cities. If you look at the map so far tonight, that's where Nikki Haley is performing strongest. And that's a warning sign. And it's one that she tried to blare about when she gave that sort of early quasi-concession speech. And that's a concern for Donald Trump's campaign, right? He has run up the margin in rural areas. He did it in 2016 to win. Joe Biden cut into some of those margins in 2020. And these early results show that if he's going to win again in 2024, Donald Trump is going to need to swell that vote in rural areas because he's capped in these suburban areas. That is where Nikki Haley is strongest, and it is where even Ron DeSantis was stronger. This is the part of the Republican Party, the traditional part of the Republican Party, that has left under Donald Trump. And he needs to win back more voters in other parts of the state.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember, we talk a lot about the coalition, the people Biden needs to bring back. He does need to bring people back. He did beat Donald Trump by 7 million votes in 2020. Sam, you wrote a story kind of about independence and about maybe some warning signs, I think it's fair to say. Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about your reporting.
Well, it basically mirrors what Shane was saying there. And I think it's worth remembering that, like, in 2016, when Donald Trump was new onto the scene in this state, too, his coalition was very different than what we saw tonight. He was actually making appeals to independent and moderate voters in New Hampshire. Now, those voters may not be your traditional independents. They may be more conservative leaning. And also, they may have drifted over these past 8 years and become more Trumpist. But tonight, his appeal was really centered on self-identified conservative voters. And if you look at the data points, I mean, the moderates broke against him alarmingly if you're the Trump campaign. Those people, if you talk to them during the course of the week, they're not just pro-Haley voters. They are anti-Trump voters. You ask them, like, what would it take for you to vote for Donald Trump in the election? And one of the person went to me and said, I'd rather die. I mean,
right, it's it's very dramatic.
You're not going to vote for Trump. I get it. There are some other data points, and I thought this was interesting. If Trump was convicted, would he be fit to serve? In New Hampshire, the voters who supported Haley were unanimously against it. The voters who, they said 14% yes, 84% no. That shows real deep-seated anger and angst about his trials. It suggests that this electorate, at least the ones that were voting for Haley, are not going to be surefire Trump voters should he become the nominee. And if you're Trump, look, I mean, there's good ways to spin this. You've obviously made history as the first non-incumbent Republican to win these first two states. You've done it by big margins in both states. But, you know, someone else was saying this. He's a quasi-incumbent to a degree, right? Like, he is the guy in the Republican circle. And if you're still, if your competition is getting 44%, there are warning signs there.
Yeah, there are some warning signs. And plus, there's a trove of data in here, as there always is when there's an outcome from an election. What were your takeaways on the signs that are, there's some that are bad for Trump, there's some that are interesting and compelling for Biden. What did you take out of the data we've seen so far?
Well, the big thing I think would be, compared to 2020, where Biden did, well with enough Republican voters and, independents who lean Republican. That was part of how he won that close race. And that was, during COVID, where I think there was a lot of, higher income, college educated Republicans and independents who were really turned off by Trump's performance or lack thereof. I think the pool of voters that the Biden campaign can target is much larger than in 20. And, from a campaign perspective, that is hugely beneficial to them. So I don't know if it's, double. It's probably not quite that. But in Wisconsin and Arizona and Georgia and Pennsylvania and Michigan, you've got core Democratic voters, and you want to make sure those turn out. Then you look at, Republicans, particularly women, but not just women, independents, and moderate vote generally. I mean, in America, the person who wins the moderate vote almost always wins the presidency. And some of the polls that I think got people very worried back at the end of last year, even some of them now, I think probably showed Trump overperforming what he's ultimately going to get. So that's the benefit for the Biden campaign as you look in Iowa, in New Hampshire. By the way, this is not Republican general election voters. These are people that participate in primaries. So if you expand that out to people who are likely to vote in a general election, and of course we live in a world of data and modeling, so you can model in every state who looks just like those voters who are saying they're not going to vote for Trump or who voted for Haley. But the people who particularly are saying they wouldn't vote for Trump, despite participating in the Republican primary, that is data gold for the Biden campaign.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, they have so much they can pull from these primary races to kind of lessons learned for the general. So, Tim, one of the groups of people who have not been fully out there entirely is some of these former Trump staffers, former Trump officials, some of whom have spoken out at limited times. I'm not saying they would appeal to all these Haley voters, but what is the best strategy with them? What can be done with them? They may not want to be at the convention with Joe Biden, but what's the best way to get them out there to kind of show these voters, look, there's a bridge, come over, come to our side, this is a better side?
Yeah, it wouldn't hurt for them to be at the convention with Joe Biden, maybe, or at least having some of them.
Sure, they're invited. I'm going to invite them, not that I have that role, but still.
Yeah, exactly. Look, I think that what we learned in 2020, I was working for a group called Republican Voters Against Trump, and what you learned is that these gettable voters want to hear from people like them. So they don't really want to be lectured to by, never Trump or DC consultants like me. And they don't, they want to hear from people who also liked some things about Trump, right? So I think that having people that went in and worked for Trump and voted for Trump in 2020, vocally making the case to these Nikki Haley voters who are going to be an important swing demographic, that they saw him firsthand, and what these guys suspect about Trump is even worse than what they believe. I think that's going to be a compelling message to a certain demo of Republican primary voters, and hopefully that can be used. I do just, if you'd allow me, there's one little damper I have to put on all this. It's just worth saying. This is true.
Damper us.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There are green shoots for Biden, no doubt, and these Haley voters will be very important. But Donald Trump 3 years ago was impeached. There were Republican members of the Senate for the first time ever of his own party that voted to convict him and prevent him from running. When he announced his candidacy, his family wouldn't even show up. And now he's about to win the biggest landslide in the history of the Republican primary in modern times. So there are some weak signs, no doubt. There's some signs for Biden to exploit, no doubt. But it's alarming, given his record, just how clear this victory is. I understand the caveat that he's a quasi-incumbent, but still, there's not really any parallel in the Republican side.
Classic Tim Miller right there.
Classic Tim. Well, look, I think it's important to recognize, as Tim just alluded to, I mean, this is quite a comeback.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, he just made a major comeback. He's now going to likely be the Republican nominee.
There was polls in New Hampshire, like from the beginning of this primary, where he was trailing Ron DeSantis. I mean, it was not a foregone conclusion that we would end up in this spot. But things happened. Primarily, he went on trial, got the indictments, and the base rallied around him, and here we are.
That's a perfect tee-up to what we'll be talking about after we take a quick break. David Plouffe, thank you so much for all of your time, analysis, staying up late. I really appreciate it. And up next, we're going to dig into that exit poll Sam mentioned earlier about how Republicans are feeling about the possibility that Donald Trump will be convicted of a crime. We'll talk about that coming up next. after his win in New Hampshire tonight, the next big event on Donald Trump's calendar could very well be an appearance in court. The second trial stemming from E. Jean Carroll's defamation lawsuit against him is expected to begin again on Thursday. Of course, the former president has essentially been using his court appearances as an extension of his presidential campaign. And while lots of Republican voters aren't too concerned about his legal peril, there are many who are. An exit poll in New Hampshire shows that 42% of voters said that they would not consider Donald Trump fit to be president if he were convicted of a crime. So the GOP might want to consider this. Should Trump wrap up the nomination as quickly as he wants to, which is very soon, and if he's then found guilty at a criminal trial, the party may be stuck with a candidate that lots of Americans say they wouldn't support. Sam Stein, Shane Goldmacher, Jennifer Palmieri, and Tim Miller are all back with me. So, Sam, let me start with you because we're kind of moving maybe into this general election here rapidly, especially if you listen to Joe Biden. Trump has been running this campaign in a courtroom. Yeah. He's been spending more time in a courtroom than he has been hugging babies, picking up babies, maybe for the better, than doing that. What is that? Does he shift that now, or do you think he continues to run the same strategy moving forward?
It's a good question. I mean, first of all, I want to do like a Tim Miller thing where you sort of step back and like acknowledge the weirdness of it all.
Do a step back. It is weird. I think it's important to acknowledge that.
We'll call it a Tim Miller. I mean, if you think about like the idea that a presidential candidate would deliberately take himself off a campaign trail to go sit in a court where he's on trial for defaming a woman who he's accused of sexual assault. Like that, it doesn't really compute in normal political...
Who he then is going to attack and literally posted 40 times on Truth Social about.
Well, that doesn't... I mean, that's not like in traditional... I don't... You know, you wouldn't have to find a strategist who would recommend doing that.
Correct.
But it worked for Trump in the context of this primary. Does it work for Trump outside of the primary, I think is what you're getting at, which is if this election starts to shift, if Nikki Haley, you know, gracefully goes out, like, does he stop doing this stuff? And I actually don't know. I mean, part of what's motivating him is general anger over the trials, and obviously he feels he's being unfairly prosecuted and maligned and all that stuff. I think, you know, his team is very transparent about the idea that it is also to his political advantage in the context of a Republican primary. They fundraise well. They watched as every single competitor, almost every single competitor, not Chris Christie or Asa Hutchinson, rally behind him, and as many said they would pardon him. But if you look at these numbers, I mean, yeah, like Republican primary voters are cool with it and, in fact, support him over it. But, you know, the general electorate finds it appalling and frankly, probably will not vote for him if he's convicted.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say, even in those numbers that you see, what share of Republicans might have concerns if he gets convicted, I think what we've seen is that so many Republican voters eventually come to agree with Donald Trump, whatever Donald Trump says.
He moves the goalposts and they kind of run after him. So far, in the base, right?
In the base, but the base has been enough to likely get him the nomination for a third consecutive election. One of my favorite things I found in the exit polls in Iowa was a number from 2016 to 2024. So in 2016, he was in 5th place among voters who cared about a candidate who shares my values. He won only 5%. And this time, he dominated that group. He won 43% of people. So Donald Trump's values didn't dramatically change in the last 8 years.
In fact, there are a lot of things that happened that you would argue were worse value proposition actions. You know?
And yet, they think the Republican Party base thinks whatever he stands for is what they stand for. And so the positions now on if he's convicted, I think those are things that could change over the course of the campaign. Yes, the middle of the road is absolutely going to be turned off, but the base of the Republican Party seems to be with him.
Well, the electorate is much bigger, though, than the base, which is an important thing. So, Palmieri, I mean, the Biden campaign, Joe Biden, first of all, is such a traditional. This is one of the things people like about him, but angers sometimes, you know, hardcore progressives and supporters, in that he doesn't speak about the legal cases. He doesn't wade into them. The campaign doesn't really do that either. Do you think that's their strategy moving forward, or how do they deal with this? It's going to be such a dominant issue over the next several months.
I think I'm thinking about the summer of 22 when the Jan 6 committee had their hearings. And I know that the campaign will do what the campaign will do. We both know you used to have to answer questions about how the President Biden would not involve himself in these kinds of court cases, and I don't think that they will do it, but I think that there will be a concentrated effort to tell, as these trials are going on, to tell voters a larger story about it. The Jan 6 committee was so good at telling that narrative, and they had a big impact. So it's kind of hard to process because we certainly have not seen this before. But I think when these trials do start happening, and, I heard just anecdotally watching the coverage today, people bring up specifically the classified documents at Mar-a-Lago as being a concern. And obviously Jan 6 being a concern, so many people who voted for Haley said that they refused to buy into the big lie. That Jan 6 committee at that Jan 6 hearing is supposed to start in the spring, possibly even March. And this is a whole other dynamic that's going to get unleashed that we haven't seen before, but it could be a really big deal. The campaign is not going to ignore it. The Biden campaign is very aware of what's happening. It's just a question of who the right voices are that's talking about it.
And how they talk about it. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can kind of do this in a sweeping way, right? Like he did in the democracy speech. It's really interesting how they turn up the volume on it a little bit. So, Tim, let me just point this question to you, too. I mean, you, Palmieri, and I are all sort of recovering political communicators in many ways. And one of the things you have to think about often is how you stay on your message, but how you kind of break through a dominant storyline, right? How are you present in it in a way that's advantageous? So what would you be doing if you were the Biden campaign about all these legal cases that are going to dominate the airwaves and oxygen over the next couple months?
Well, it is part of the democracy message, right? I mean, it is part of the maintaining normalcy message. And so I don't think I would be afraid to talk about it if I was the Biden campaign. And that doesn't necessarily mean, Joe Biden doesn't need to be standing outside the courthouse in New York with Vaughn Hilliard, whoever's reporting out there, doing man-on-the-street interviews about it necessarily. But he can talk about it, right? And he can give interviews. You can speak about it from the White House. The Democrats can have surrogates there that are bird-dogging Donald Trump at his various trials. There can be paid advertisements that are run in some of these key states that highlight some of the craziest stuff. I think that there are a lot of voters out there that don't even realize that Donald Trump has been, civilly at least, convicted of rape. I don't know that I think there are people out there that don't realize it. So I think that you can run ads, to that effect. So I think that there's a lot that can be done, and this campaign is going to be run with that as the context.
Sam Stein, Shane Goldmacher, Jennifer Palmieri, Tim Miller. I know you all would like to stay another hour.
Yeah, wait,
we
this
could.
is it.
We could. Thank you for staying up very late with us and really helping make clear a lot of the results tonight and what's coming up moving forward. And up next, a conversation I've been looking forward to all night. No one knows more about these candidates, I promise you, and these states they're competing in than the NBC News campaign embeds. They join me next. From my experience working on campaigns, and I've done a few of them, I know that no one knows more about these candidates, I promise you, and these early states than the campaign embeds. And this year, there are 9 of them for NBC News, and they've been working around the clock, I mean that literally, traveling countless miles in cars, trains, planes, walking to get to the next campaign event. And I'm so excited because 4 of them were able to stay up very late with us tonight. And joining me now for 4 of our NBC News campaign embeds, Nnamdi Igboanu, who was covering Senator Tim Scott's presidential campaign, and a mixed bag of everything else, I will say. Jake Traylor, who is covering the Donald Trump campaign, Greg Hyatt, who's covering Nikki Haley's campaign, and Emma Barnett, who's been living in New Hampshire for the last 7 months preparing for this night. So I also learned you all have a text chain with each other where you share things, which I really want to be on. But Nnamdi, let me start with you, because as I just mentioned, you were on Tim Scott's campaign. You obviously covered kind of his rise, his fall, his support of the Trump team. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about what you learned about his journey and really about New Hampshire over the last several weeks.
Well, Tim Scott's journey was an interesting one because I think in many aspects, his time in New Hampshire proved detrimental to his campaign in some aspects. I think one thing you learn about the New Hampshire voters here is that it's a very unique culture here. The voters here take seriously the fact that they are the first in the nation primary, and that informs how they interact with candidates. They take advantage of having access to these candidates, and they will take the opportunity, if you're someone like Tim Scott that strolls into a diner, to hit you with a really tough question like, if you can't stand up to Trump, how are you going to stand up to Xi Jinping?
You can't just have a cheeseburger here. You have to be ready for it.
They really, really take the responsibility serious. And, there are many times where, if you're dealing with a candidate like a Tim Scott, like a Nikki Haley, who at times weren't the most open with press, oftentimes the way you got that quote, the way you got into their brain was taking advantage of a voter asking a question that just happened to be news of day. And that's how you got the information. And that's something that personally I hadn't seen in any other state. So
it's such an interesting point. Voters ask really great questions, which is such a good point. So, Jake, you have been given the task of following the Trump campaign. And one of the things we've been talking about a little bit this evening is how important it is to understand the demographics, the dynamics of the Trump the Trump coalition of people who support him. So tell us a little bit about that, anything that surprised you, and kind of what's going on as they look ahead to South Carolina.
Yeah, sure. So 4 embeds are sitting here. We all have this unique opportunity to really understand our candidate in a strange way. We know the words they're going to say often before they say them. We understand their emotions. And so looking at Donald Trump tonight here in New Hampshire, I think I had 2 big takeaways. One was that he was very pleased with the election results here in the Granite State, a wide margin of victory. Secondly, he was not so pleased with Nikki Haley's speech and her saying she would not be bowing out of the race. She'd be sticking it through. Whenever he was
clearly displeased, I think it's safe to say. He was very diplomatic.
The entire time, from the moment he stepped on the stage for his victory speech, which is typically emblematic of welcoming the party in and a message of unity. He said this is not going to be a normal victory speech. And the remainder of the time, he was very staunchly critical of Nikki Haley, saying that she was an imposter, saying that she falsely claimed victory of the election. And so now, as Donald Trump looks ahead to Nevada, to South Carolina, he's finding himself in this interesting position where he's threading this needle of trying to look ahead to a general election and make this pivot, but also being stuck in a primary election where there's still a potential viable candidate that exists. And so
both dynamics are so important. It sounds like you're going to be following, you're going to be reporting into NBC News about all of them. Okay, you've had a bit of an up and down with, not you personally, I mean the Nikki Haley, let me rephrase that, the Haley campaign, because, just a couple of weeks ago when Chris Christie dropped out, it felt like maybe she's going to be on the rise, and then tonight she did better, I would say, than some expectations, but didn't beat him. Tell us a little bit about that campaign, what their vibes are internally right now, and kind of what you're hearing from them.
Yeah, I mean, they're feeling really confident about the fact they're going to South Carolina next. I mean, when you consider the fact that you look at some of the external polling that came out here in New Hampshire, and they did well. Her whole game plan was to do better than Iowa. She wanted to have a stronger showing, and they feel like they've done that. But now she gets to create an opportunity where she has an opportunity to say, okay, there is a binary choice between herself and Donald Trump. That is what she's always desired to present to the American people, and now she has that. So now you move on to South Carolina, which of course is her home state, but it's also a state that Donald Trump has a lot of success in the past. But she feels and loves the fact that she can be that underdog. And even though people look at the polling in South Carolina and say, okay, there are going to be challenges there, Nikki Haley sees that and says, that's an opportunity to present myself as showing that I have longevity in this race.
It's going to be a very interesting one to watch. She says she's going to be in. We'll see if she's in. She's going to go back. She has a rally tomorrow, right?
She does, in Charleston.
They're
not wasting any time.
They're not. We're going to hear more about it from you. Okay, Emma, you gave us a great rundown of where to go out to eat in New Hampshire. So thank you for that, first of all.
Anytime.
Not at all, but thank you for that. Tell us a little bit about this state. It is a unique state. The demographics are interesting and compelling. Was going to be a good state for Nikki Haley. What have you learned about New Hampshire and kind of the demographics of the state over the last time you've been here?
Jen, if I were to use one adjective to describe the voters here in New Hampshire, it would be strategic. And that really came into a clear, focused picture this afternoon when I was at different polling locations speaking to different voters. Republicans who decided to vote for Donald Trump. Many of them told me they don't like his personality, but they like what he has to say about immigration. They liked the economy under his presidency, and therefore strategically voted for a person who they knew versus someone who was an unknown, essentially, in a national context. Now, when it comes to undeclared voters, they are the ones who really shaped the New Hampshire primary because they make up about 40% of the electorate, and they get to choose whether they take a Democratic or a Republican ballot. And that is really key here in New Hampshire. And it's honestly been a bit of a roller coaster following the New Hampshire primary, because if there was a state that Nikki Haley could really take it home to, it would have been New Hampshire, because she is a moderate candidate backed by a moderate governor, comparatively to someone like Donald Trump. And we saw her crowds. Greg and I used to cover events up in North Country where there were 30 people there back in July. And at some of her latest events, there were 800 to 1,000 people. But when you're competing against a former president with the name ID that Donald Trump has, that makes it really difficult.
Very, very challenging. Well, let me just say again, there is no group that's harder working, I promise you, probably in NBC News than this group and your other 5 embed colleagues. So thank you for all of the reporting. Thank you for all of the insights and everything you guys have done over the last couple of months, longer than that. And good luck on the trail ahead. That does it for me tonight. There's much more New Hampshire primary coverage coming up after this quick break. For now, good night, good morning, good middle of the night, all of that from Manchester.